The last thing you hear before eternal silence is always a breath. Not yours, but someone who stayed behind. And in that hallway where the smell of white lilies mixed with something chemical and ancient, where the fluorescent light flickered as if it too was tired of witnessing goodbyes, a man with calloused hands and sunken eyes watched each person who crossed those doors as if he could read their entire history just by the way they held the strap of a purse or avoided their own reflection in the dark glass. How many times do we look at a stranger and pretend there isn't a storm happening inside them? How many times do we walk past someone carrying words so heavy they could sink ships, and we move on as if that encounter meant absolutely nothing? There are places where time moves differently, where every second seems stretched like old chewing gum, and the funeral home was exactly that kind of portal, a space between what was and what will never be again, and there, among mahogany caskets and floral arrangements that would arrive too late to be seen by the right eyes, existed this man who wasn't an owner, wasn't a director, wasn't anything but someone who prepared the dead for their last presentation to the world, but who had this peculiar habit, this strange and disturbing tendency to strike up conversations with strangers at the most inappropriate moments, to look into the eyes of someone destroyed by loss and say things nobody asked to hear, things that sounded sometimes like ancestral wisdom, sometimes like the ravings of someone who'd spent too much time surrounded by corpses. The whole city knew his stories, those urban legends that spread in whispers at bars at midnight, in supermarket lines, in message groups where people shared their strange experiences with that man who seemed to know too much about everyone, who seemed to see through skin and bones straight into the most scared and raw part of the human soul. If you're watching this right now, do something for me, hit that subscribe button, because you just entered a story that's going to change how you see the people around you. Leave that like, because this story needs to reach more people. And tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? I want to know where these stories are echoing, where these words end up. The first time he said something that really mattered was on a Tuesday in March, when the sky was that leaden color that precedes storms and a woman entered the funeral home wearing a black dress that had been used at too many funerals. You could tell by the way the fabric was worn at the shoulders, as if sadness had literally faded the black. She had dry eyes, dangerously dry, the kind of person who'd already cried everything she had to cry and now only a barren desert remained where tears used to be. She came to make arrangements for her father, a man who had died alone in an apartment that smelled of cigarettes and regret, found 3 days later by a neighbor who noticed the smell. She talked with the funeral director mechanically, choosing a casket like someone choosing cereal at the supermarket, not really looking, just pointing and nodding. That's when he appeared, coming from one of the back rooms, those that clients normally don't see, his hands still damp from washing, smelling of hospital soap and something else, something that has no name but everyone recognizes when they feel it. He stopped beside her, and without being invited, without any kind of social preamble, said in a voice that sounded like stones rolling in a current, "Your father kept a letter for you for 23 years but never had the courage to deliver it. It's in his dresser drawer, under the black socks, on the left side, and you'll need to read it before you close that casket, because there are things the dead can't carry to the other side. There are weights that need to stay here." The woman froze. The funeral director cleared his throat, embarrassed, tried to steer the conversation back to practical details, but she was no longer there, not mentally. She was already running to her father's apartment, already opening that drawer, and that's exactly what she did as soon as she signed the last papers. She found the letter, written in the shaky handwriting of a man who had never been good with words, apologizing for all the times he chose the bottle over his daughter, for all the birthdays he spent passed out on the couch, for being a ghost in her own life. The letter ended saying she had been the only beautiful thing he'd ever done in this world, and that he hoped she could remember him not for the monster he became, but for the man he tried to be when she was little and the world still had hope. She came back to the funeral home the next day, not to change anything in the arrangements, but just to ask how he knew. The man was sweeping the parking lot, moving the broom in slow, methodical circles, and when she asked, he just looked at her with those eyes that seemed to have seen the end of everything 1,000 times and said, "The dead speak, not with words, but they speak, and when you spend enough time with them, you learn to hear what they left behind." The city started talking. Stories multiplied like mushrooms after rain. There was the man who came to bury his wife and heard from him that she had a second phone hidden in the car, that there were things he needed to know before idealizing her too much in memory, that grief needs to be honest or it turns to poison. There was the mother who lost her teenage son in a motorcycle accident and was told the boy had written a poem about her in his literature notebook, that it was there forgotten under the bed among comics and dirty socks, a poem that said she was the strongest person he knew and that he was afraid he'd never be half of what she was. There was the elderly widower who was informed that his late wife had planted sunflower seeds in the back of the yard 3 days before she died, that she knew she was leaving and wanted to leave something growing, something yellow and cheerful that would remind him that life continues even when it hurts too much. Each story was different, but all had this bizarre pattern of being true, of being verifiable, of bringing information he simply couldn't have known. People started going to the funeral home not only when they had dead to bury, but when they were lost, when they needed answers, when life had become a labyrinth without exit. He never charged, never asked for anything in return, just said what he saw, what he heard, what the dead whispered through him in some way that nobody could explain but everyone who passed through there felt in their spine. The funeral director tried to fire him twice. The first time, because a family had complained that he was inappropriate, that he'd told the widow her husband had a second bank account she didn't know about, hidden money for a life he was planning to live without her, and that this had been too cruel, had destroyed the memory she wanted to preserve. But the widow came back a week later with flowers, because she'd found the account, had also found emails proving the husband was planning to ask for a divorce, and she thanked him for not having spent years idealizing a ghost, for being able to finally feel anger, finally process the truth, finally truly move on. The director gave up on firing him when he realized people were choosing that funeral home specifically because of him, that families came from other cities just to have the chance to hear what he had to say. So he made a silent agreement, one of those that's never said out loud but everyone understands. He could continue doing what he did, as long as he didn't scare the clients, as long as it didn't turn into a circus. But not everything he said was well received. There was the time he told a father that the son who had died from an overdose wasn't an accident, that the boy had left a video on the computer explaining he couldn't take it anymore, that the pressure to be perfect, to meet expectations, to be the lawyer the father always wanted instead of the musician he really was had been too much. The father left swearing he'd sue, that he'd destroy him, but never came back, and months later someone saw him at a jazz show in an obscure downtown bar, crying quietly while the band played. There was the woman who was informed that her mother, before dying of cancer, had recorded voice messages for her on her old cell phone, one for each year until she turned 30, saved in a hidden folder that needed a password, and the password was the name of the dog they had when she was a child. The woman became obsessed, spent days trying passwords, until she finally got it right and heard her mother's voice for the first time in 2 years, heard her laughing, telling stories, giving advice, saying I love you in every possible way. She came back to thank him, but he was no longer sweeping the parking lot, was in one of those back rooms, preparing another body, making another dead person presentable for the last time they'd be seen, and she left flowers at the reception with a note that only said, "You gave me my mother back." The theories about him multiplied. Some said he was a medium, that he'd been born with this strange gift of hearing the dead. Others swore he was just very observant, that he studied the dead so intensely he could deduce things about their lives through small details, a hidden tattoo, a callus on the hands, the way the body had been found. There were people who thought he was a charlatan, that he investigated families beforehand, that he scoured social media and talked to neighbors, building a psychological profile he then used to seem mystical. But none of these theories explained how he knew things that were literally hidden, objects in specific places, passwords, details that no living person knew. The truth is nobody knew, not even he seemed able to explain it properly. When asked, he gave vague answers, said things like, "When you look at a dead body for real, not just look but really see, you realize they're still screaming, still trying to talk, and someone needs to listen, someone needs to pass the message along." There was a period when he stopped. 3 whole months without saying anything to anyone, just did his work in silence, prepared the bodies, cleaned the rooms, went home at the end of the day without looking at anyone. People noticed, started asking, some were relieved because they found him disturbing, but others missed it, felt something important had been lost. It was the funeral director who finally asked what had happened, and he answered that he'd seen too much, heard too much, that carrying the last wishes of the dead had started to weigh like cement on his shoulders, that he was starting to forget what it was to be alive because he spent so much time thinking about death. He said he tried to stop, had tried to disconnect, but the dead wouldn't stop talking, wouldn't stop asking, wouldn't stop begging for their messages to be delivered. So he came back, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice, because that had stopped being a gift or a curse to simply become what he was. The turning point came on a humid Thursday in October, when a teenage girl entered the funeral home with her grandmother. They came to make arrangements for the grandfather who had died of a heart attack while watching television. The girl was about 15, hair dyed blue, deep circles under her eyes that told stories she was too young to carry. While the grandmother talked with the director, she wandered the hallways, looking at the urns on display, touching the plastic flowers that decorated the corner tables. That's when he appeared, coming from somewhere she didn't see, and stood beside her without saying anything for so long she started to feel uncomfortable. Then he said, with that voice of stones in the current, "You're planning it, and I need to tell you it's not today, it's not like this." She froze, her face losing all color, and he continued, "Your grandfather wants you to know he understands the pain, that he was also on the edge when he was young, after he came back from the war, when everything seemed gray and meaningless, and that it was his grandmother, your great-grandmother, who held his hand and said the pain passes but only if you stay, only if you endure one more day, and then another, until one day you wake up and realize you want to stay. He saw you writing the letter last night, the one you hid at the bottom of the drawer, and he wants you to know you're stronger than you imagine, that 15 years isn't enough time to know how much life can still surprise you." The girl collapsed right there, on the cold floor of the funeral home, crying in a way that made her whole body shake. The grandmother came running, the director too, but he just stood there, watching, waiting for her to compose herself. When she finally managed to speak, she asked how he knew, and he said her grandfather had held his hand while being prepared, an impossible thing because the man had been dead for 12 hours, but he swore he felt it, felt the cold fingers squeezing his and heard clear as day, "Save my granddaughter, please, she can't go yet." The girl found help after that, started therapy, started medication, and a year later she came back to the funeral home just to show him she was still alive, that she'd chosen to stay. She brought a drawing she'd made, a portrait of him all in shades of gray except for the eyes, which she'd painted gold, because she said they were the eyes of someone who saw light even surrounded by death. The years passed and he continued there, continued being that strange employee who said things too important to be ignored. He aged in that place, his hair turning white, his hands more tremulous, but his eyes still with that disturbing glow of someone who sees beyond the veil. He never married, never had children, never seemed to want anything beyond that, being there at the frontier between life and death, being the messenger of last words. There were people who offered money, who wanted to hire him to try to talk to their dead, but he always refused, said it didn't work like that he didn't control anything, that he was just a channel, a phone that rang when the dead had something urgent to say. The story that changed everything happened on a harsh winter, when a middle-aged man entered the funeral home dragging his feet, came to make arrangements for his younger sister who had died in a car accident. He was destroyed in a different way. It wasn't just sadness, it was guilt, it was something that corroded from the inside like acid. He talked with the director automatically, signing papers without reading, choosing things without seeing. When the employee appeared, the man didn't even look at him, but he spoke anyway, said, "She doesn't blame you for what happened that night, she wants you to know that." The man slowly raised his head, his eyes bloodshot, and he continued, "You couldn't know she was going to borrow your car, couldn't know you'd been drinking and the brakes had problems, couldn't know she was going to die because of choices you made but that weren't meant to affect her. She wants you to know she forgives you, and more importantly, that you need to forgive yourself, because if you don't, you're going to die too, it's just going to take decades and it's going to hurt every second." The man fell to his knees right there, screaming in an animalistic way, all the weight of guilt coming out in waves of sound. It took 20 minutes to calm him down, to get him up from the floor. But something changed in him that day, you could see it, as if a giant stone had been lifted from his chest. Months later, He started working at an NGO against drunk driving, speaking at schools, saving lives by telling his story. And every time he spoke, he ended by saying, "A man in a funeral home saved me when I was already dead inside, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to honor the forgiveness my sister gave me through him." The question nobody could ever answer was, and him? Who listened to his dead? Who carried the weight of the words he kept? Who, at the end of the day, when all the families had gone home and he was alone with the bodies in those cold and silent rooms, held his hand and said everything would be okay? The answer, perhaps, was nobody. Maybe that was the price of being the bridge. You get stuck in the middle, neither here nor there, just existing in that liminal space where messages transit. There was a time when a journalist tried to do a story about him, wanted to interview him, document the phenomenon, but he refused all cameras, all recorders, said some mysteries need to remain mysteries because it's the not knowing that keeps people believing there's more in the world than just flesh and bones. He had his rituals. Every end of shift, after everyone had gone, he lit a candle in a specific room, the one where the bodies stayed before being prepared, and sat there in the dark with just that weak light flickering, and sometimes he spoke in a low voice, talked with the dead as if they were old friends, thanked them for trusting him with the messages, apologized when he couldn't deliver one because the family didn't want to hear it or because he arrived too late. There was a worn chair in that room, the leather cracked from so much use, and that's where he sat, night after night, keeping vigil over those who no longer had anyone to watch over them. The funeral director retired and the new owner considered firing him, because he was already old, hands too tremulous, vision failing. But when the families found out, they made a petition, hundreds of people who had been touched by his words, who had received closure through him, who considered him an essential part of the grieving process. The new owner gave up on the idea, but placed an assistant to help him, a young man who at first thought it was all ridiculous, pure theater, but who after 3 months working side by side started seeing things he couldn't explain, the way the dead seemed more at peace after he finished preparing them, as if something had been resolved, some tension released. One of the most disturbing stories happened when a woman arrived to pick up her husband's ashes, who had asked to be cremated. She was strangely calm, even smiled, which made the employee pay attention. When she held the urn, he said, "You put poison in his food, you're not grieving, you're relieved." The woman froze, the smile disappearing like paint in rain, and for a second it seemed she would deny, would scream, would sue, but then she just sighed deeply and said, "He beat me for 15 years, broke my arm 3 times, raped me whenever he drank, and I couldn't leave because he threatened to kill my mother, so I waited, planned, and made it look like a heart attack." The employee stood still, and then, to everyone's surprise including his own, said, "He wants you to know he remembers when you were young, before the drinking, before the violence, when he was still human, and he knows that man died long before the body, and that you only finalized what was already finished years ago. He says you deserve to be free." The woman started crying, not from sadness but from relief, and left there carrying the urn and one less weight. Nobody ever knew if he really called the police afterward, if he told what he knew, but no investigation was opened, no arrest was made, and the woman was seen months later at a cafe smiling for real, without looking over her shoulder. Time continued its relentless march and he continued there, a permanent fixture of that place of transition. There was a period when he stopped leaving the funeral home, started sleeping there, in a small back room that had been storage, and the new owner allowed it because it was easier that way, because he'd already merged completely with that space, was already part of the architecture as much as the walls and floor. People who came for night viewing sometimes heard him talking alone in the empty rooms, and some swore they heard responses, voices that weren't his echoing through the hallways, but nobody ever had the courage to go check. He had a notebook, old and battered, where he wrote things the dead said but that he couldn't deliver, either because he didn't know who the recipient was, or because he arrived too late. Pages and pages of undelivered last words, of regrets that would die with him, of I love yous that would never reach the right ears. Sometimes he reread that notebook on sleepless nights, and cried quietly, because each line there was a failure, a message he couldn't complete, a bridge that collapsed in the middle. The city changed around that funeral home, new buildings went up, streets were widened, generations passed, but that place remained, and he remained inside it, aging like wine or souring like milk, nobody knew for sure. There were people who grew up hearing stories about him, brought their own children to meet him when some relative died, making him a kind of living legend, an urban folklore you could touch and talk to. One day, inevitably, he himself fell. He collapsed while preparing a body, a devastating stroke that left him lying in that cold room among the dead he'd cared for over decades. They found him hours later, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. They took him to the hospital, but it was too late, brain destroyed, body kept alive only by machines. The family, which nobody knew existed, a distant niece he barely knew, came to sign the papers to turn everything off. And when they brought his body back to the same funeral home where he'd worked, the new employee who had replaced him, that young man who had been his assistant, did something strange. While preparing the body, putting on the suit someone had donated, combing the white hair, he started hearing things. Whispers coming from nowhere, overlapping voices, hundreds of them, all the dead the old man had helped coming back to reciprocate, to give him what he'd given so many, a last message. And the young employee, with tears streaming down his face, started writing, page after page, everything the dead were saying about that man, all the lives he'd touched, all the weights he'd carried, all the light he'd been in a place of darkness. At the wake, which was absurdly crowded, people he'd helped traveling from distant cities just to be there, the young employee read those pages aloud, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. He talked about the woman who had found her father's letter, about the man who had discovered his sister's forgiveness, about the teenage girl who had chosen to live, about hundreds of other stories that had happened in those hallways over decades. And at the end, he said something nobody expected, that the old man had left a message too, not through the dead but through his own life, and the message was simple, it was that everyone has something important to say, everyone carries words someone needs to hear, and the only real tragedy is dying with those words still stuck in the throat. They buried him on a day with a clear sky, so blue it hurt to look at, and each person who passed by the open casket left something, a flower, a letter, a drawing, objects that were buried with him like offerings to a modern shaman. And the strange thing is that after he was buried, people started reporting similar experiences, not just at the funeral home but in hospitals, in nursing homes, anywhere death was a constant presence, as if he'd planted seeds, unintentionally taught other people to hear what the dead had to say. The young employee took his place not just in the work but in the function, and although he was never as precise, as specific, he also started picking up things, intuitions, feelings about the dead he prepared, small messages he passed along with less certainty but with the same intention. And the funeral home continued being that place where people went not just to bury their dead, but to perhaps, just perhaps, hear a last word they desperately needed to hear. Years later, a researcher from a distant university came to study the phenomenon, interview all the people who had interacted with him, trying to find a rational explanation. She spent months collecting data, recording testimonies, analyzing patterns, and in the end, wrote a thesis that concluded it was impossible to rationally explain what had happened there, that the information he had was too specific, too verifiable, that there was no trick or fraud that could explain decades of impossible hits. The thesis ended with a phrase that became famous in academic circles studying paranormal phenomena, perhaps death is not the end of communication, just a change in the medium, and some people are born being translators. The funeral home eventually closed, decades later, when the area was expropriated to build a mall. But before they demolished the building, hundreds of people held vigil in front, lit candles, told stories about that strange man who had changed their lives by giving voice to their dead. And on the night before demolition, some swore they saw a light in the window of that room where he used to sit with the dead, a candle flickering in the dark, as if someone was still there, keeping vigil, waiting for the next message to deliver. What remains, in the end, aren't the buildings or the bodies or even the exact words, but the disturbing and comforting idea that maybe there's more between life and death than the silence we expect, that maybe those who leave still have things to say, and that if we pay enough attention, if we're willing to listen with more than just our ears, maybe we can still catch those final whispers crossing the veil. And there remains the question he never answered, that perhaps had no answer, did the dead really speak to him, or was he just so good at reading the life they'd left behind that he could reconstruct what they would have said if they'd had the chance? In the end, does it matter? The message arrived, the weight was lifted, people found peace, and maybe that's the only truth that really counts. Maybe the magic isn't in proving there's life after death, but in believing that love and undelivered words can find a way back, even through the deepest silence. There's a photograph of him, the only one that survived, taken without him knowing by a grateful family. In it, he's with his back turned in one of those cold rooms, light coming through the small window creating a halo around his silhouette bent over an open casket, and you can't see his face, just the posture, that gentle inclination as if he was whispering secrets to the dead. The photo is framed now on a small headstone someone placed where the funeral home used to be, and people still go there, leave flowers, light candles, and sometimes, just sometimes, whisper their own messages to him, hoping that from somewhere, somehow, he's still listening, still doing what he always did, carrying words across the abyss between what is and what is no more. Because in the end, we're all just messages waiting to be delivered, stories seeking someone to hear them, and he understood that better than anyone. He understood that death isn't the end of the story, just the last comma before silence, and that there's always, always someone on the other side waiting to hear they were loved, they were forgiven, they mattered, they left a mark on this brief and brutal world. And if you listen carefully enough, in the quiet moments of the night when the world sleeps and the dead whisper louder, maybe you too can hear what they still have to say.